Hey, what's going on, everybody? Back with another how-to. Today we're going to be doing the front lower control arm on this 2020 370Z. Now this should fall in line with any Nissan 370Z, which is 2009 to 2020, so let's get into it now. All right, so we have the car up in the air. First step, of course, is to remove the front wheel. So we're gonna go ahead and get this thing off. 21 mil on an impact. Go ahead and fire these right out. All right, so we have the wheel off. So now we have access to everything we need. So we can go ahead and get this lower control arm out. So I'm actually just gonna start with breaking off the steering knuckle here to the ball joint on the upper control arm. I'm just going to do this so we have playroom and we can actually get in here and have as much space as possible while we're working. So this is a 14 mil. We're going to go ahead and put an impact on that, and I'm going to blast that right off. All right, so on our upper control arm ball joint, both the nut and the bolt are 14 mil. Throw a 14 millimeter wrench on the nut. Got a 14 millimeter on an impact. Blast that right off. There is our nut. And we can go ahead and get that bolt out with a rubber mallet. All right, you do want to be careful when taking this bolt out because you might be able to just pull it out and this will come forward. But once this bolt frees up from the upper control arm, it's going to come flying forward. So let's say, for example, you take a punch right here. There we go. See, broke right free. So just be careful because this will be completely loose and it's going to fall forward once you disconnect it. All right, so now that I have this freed up, I'm just going to put it back in the same spot temporarily, just with this bolt loosely, until we need this playroom and, you know, we can fly this thing forward if need be. So I'm just going to drop the upper control arm back in. All right, throw the bolt back in, and I'm just going to do it enough to hold it in place. There we go, and I should hold it just enough so I can disassemble everything else, and then when we're ready we can drop this. All right, so next step here is we're going to go ahead and disassemble this strut assembly lower bolt right here with this nut. It's a 19 millimeter. On the other side is the sway bar and the end link. All right, so I'm going to take a 19 millimeter on an impact. We're going to go ahead and fire that nut off, and then we'll work that whole assembly rod off with the sway bar so we can go ahead and free that up from the control arm. All right, 19 mil on an impact. All right, we freed that right up. Now, if you look on the other side, you can see the connecting rod on the upper part of the end link is free. Now, really, to get this completely pulled off, the easiest way is to just go ahead and remove the bottom of the end link. We can slide the bottom of the end link out and we can just remove the whole end link, and that'll give us enough space and we can get this rod out without forcing any pressure and anything like that on the end link. So we're going to crack that back nut right there on the sway bar loose. That is a 17 mil. So I'm gonna go ahead and get a 17 mil and we're going to remove that nut right from the bottom of the end link. All right, so I have a 17 mil here on impact. Fired it right off. Now you might have to put a wrench here if you're not using an impact. You know, impact usually has enough strength it can just take the nut off without having to put something on the other end. Not always, but most of the time. But if you're just using a ratchet or a breaker bar, you're probably going to have to put a wrench on this end. I believe it is a 17 mil, and then from there you can go ahead and remove the nut. So there we go. Now we can go ahead and remove the entire end link assembly, and we have that completely free from the lower control arm. All right, so we have the shock free. So there we go, no longer connected to the lower control arm. So now we're just going to move on and we're going to go ahead and get everything else disconnected from the control arm, including the mounts over here, the lower ball joint, and everything holding this thing in. So we're going to go ahead and approach the lower ball joint here. Now this does have a cotter pin in it, so we're going to free up the cotter pin, and then we're going to go ahead and remove the nut from the ball joint, and we'll go ahead and free this up from the steering knuckle. All right, so here is our lower ball joint. There is the cotter pin. I have some wire snips here. What I'm doing is I'm bending the cotter pin back into shape because it's going to be bent around the nut there. All right, and then once you have it pretty much back even, aligned in shape, you can either start hitting it from the other side, pulling it out from this side, combination of the two, whatever works, but got it coming through right here. Just pulling it on out, essentially prying while I pull him. And there it is. Cotter pin is out, and now we can approach this lower ball joint nut. All right, so this nut here is a 22 millimeter, okay? So the lower ball joint nut into the knuckle, 22 mil on the impact, of course. Break that thing right off. So go ahead and put our 22 mil to the side, and now we can go ahead and separate this knuckle from the lower control arm. All right, so the easiest way to do this is probably just going to be to get yourself a big pry bar. Just put it right in between the control arm and the bottom of the knuckle where the ball joint's going in. Should be able to pry on it a bit. All right, so now that we have the lower ball joint separated, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the rear control arm mount. So there is a 17 mil bolt head. It's right there. There is our 17 millimeter nut. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a 17 millimeter wrench right on the nut. We're gonna take the impact with a 17 mil. We're gonna fire that bolt right off. All right, 17 mil. Get this thing in there locked in. There we go, just be careful. Thing came flying out, as you can see, but we go ahead and put the nut back with the bolt. You have that first one off, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the other bolt on the inner side. That one might be a little bit trickier to get to with a wrench, but I think I could sneak it right on here. All right, I got the wrench locked in, and I should be able to fire that 17 mil out on this inner side as well. Yep, there it is. Now keep in mind, these two bolts are different sizes. The inner one is the long one, the outer one is the shorter one. All right, so put those right here. Hopefully you can see them, but inner long, outer short. All right, so make sure you know which one goes where. All right, so you can see that's a bit off from the bolts being out of that rear mount. So now the last mounting point on our lower control arm here is the front. And we're gonna go ahead and get that bolt out here with the nut on the other side. Now this is a 19 mil, so see if I can sneak you in there. There is a 19 mil right there. And here is the bolt. And I'm not going to be able to sneak an impact in there. So what I'm going to do is take a ratchet on this side here. I'll put a wrench on the other, and we'll go ahead and get that 19 right out. All right, so I think I could sneak this 19 in here. It's going to be tight. Yep, I got it. All right, so let me get the 19 on the opposite side with a wrench. All right, got the 19 on that side. All right, so let's go ahead and see if we can get this thing moving here. All right, I got it moving a hair, guys. It's pretty tight. Yep, there we go. All right, got it moving, so we're gonna go ahead and back this thing off, and we should be able to sneak this bolt right out. All right, so I have the nut off on the other side, and how I'm gonna try to sneak this thing out is I have a pry bar here. Just gonna push it while I'm backing it out. Be careful here, because you do run out of space, so let me get that out of there. See if I can just get it with the pry bar. Yep. All right, so got that snuck right out. So there is our last remaining mount bolt on the lower control arm, and we got that free. All right, guys, so as you can see, our mount is free. So last thing we're going to do here, and we should be able to sneak the control arm right out, is we're going to free up this upper ball joint again. So hit it with the rubber hammer, and what I have is a jack holding that thing safely in place, because the only thing holding it now is going to be the tie rod. So once this frees up, it's going to come flying, and if you don't have anything holding it, it's just going to be holding on by the ABS sensor and the brake line. So be careful when you drop that last bolt on this upper ball joint, because this will all come forward and it's going to be really free, and the only thing holding it is your lines, and that's the last thing you want. So I'm going to take a punch. I'm going to knock the remainder of this out. All right, and as you can see, the jack held it from flying all over the place. And now I do have enough playroom to get in here, but this isn't flopping and being held on by just the brake line and the ABS line. All right, so there we go. Now we can go ahead and get into getting that control arm out. All right guys, and before we get the control arm out, as I said, I have this on a jack. So as you can see, I just rolled this to the side, just rolled it out of the way. It's supported by the jack, loosen up the ABS sensor. It's a little bit of tension on the brake hose, but it's not being supported by that, so that's fine. Just be careful of your tie rod. Just make sure it's not a crazy amount of torque or pressure on that bushing, which could potentially rip it, but just make sure you get this thing smoothly out of the way. So now I have enough space to just address this control arm. All right guys, so I'm just gonna start working this thing out. Hit it a few times with this rubber mallet. Should be able to free it up a bit. Just be careful. Obviously you don't want a lot of pressure on any point of this while you're pulling it out. All right, get that whacked out of place, and you need to be careful right here are these lines. You're not going to be able to pull that straight out. It's almost got to come out on an angle. So obviously I started hitting it here, separated the front mount. Now this whole control arm should be able to be snuck right on out. There it is. Front control arm is out. All right, so there is our old control arm. There is our new one. And just for reference, the reason this is being done is this car hit a curb really hard on the front passenger side here. It was put on an alignment machine, and it was recommended for the control arm to be replaced. So that's what we're doing. So this is the OEM part number right there. It's 54500-JL01A. All right, so one thing before we put the new control arm on is these little bushings right here. They go on the outer part of the front mount. All right, so this mount here, just pull them off of the old one, put them on, and you should be good. All right, now one more thing we got to do with the old control arm is, even though the new control arm comes with a ball joint, it doesn't come with this cone. All right, so we got to remove this cone in order for that to fit and seat good in the bottom of the steering knuckle and not have play. So we need to get that off, and what I'm going to use is a 2-3 jaw puller. All right, you can get these right from AutoZone. That's the part number for this particular one. It's an OEM Tools 25901, but that is a tool we're going to be using, and we're going to go ahead and pull this cone off of this old ball joint. All right, I got this thing on about as best as I can get it. You can see all three locked in. So this is a 13 mil on the end of this particular puller. So I'm going to go ahead, take a socket wrench, and we're going to go ahead and put that on there and start turning. All right, I'm going to go ahead and try impact on it as well. There it is. Heard it pop right off. And there we go. We got our cone off, and now we can get this installed on the new ball joint. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get the new control arm in. So what we're going to do is grab this, and we're going to sneak it in just how we took it out. Now I'm going to go ahead and get this snuck behind this line here. That rear mount, I did lose one of these bushing pads right there, so just be careful. Now I'm going to try to get this thing started. All right. I'm having a bit of trouble getting that thing aligned in the position it's in, so I think the easiest thing might be just to fire these three 14mm bolts off of this black bracket on the side of the control arm, which is where the bottom of our strut shock assembly goes. So I'm just going to fire these out, and hopefully I can sneak that to the side enough to get that aligned. So all right guys, so as you can see, I was trying to get it in with the strut still in place, and you know, I could have cut all that out, but I decided to leave it because I want you guys to see that, in my opinion, it would be a lot easier to go ahead and remove the strut assembly. So I was trying to sneak it in with the jack here and this front mount, but I couldn't get it. So what we're going to do is drop the strut assembly, and then from there we should be able to just push the control arm right into position without this fighting us and trying to get this aligned in the position while doing that at the same time. So first, to get this out, we're pretty much already halfway there. We're just going to go ahead and separate that 12 mil, which is holding the brake hose right here. All right, so just going to take a 12 mil, got it on my impact, got that off. All right, so I can go ahead and get this nut off here. And that should remove the brake hose, and then we could go ahead and get to the top and we'll remove it from the strut mount. All right, so the only thing left here holding this strut in is the 3 nuts here on the top. There's 2 here and 1 right in the back. Kind of hard to see. I already got it off, but see if I can get an angle. There you go. You can see where that stud is, but 3 12 mils, and I should be able to sneak around and get all 3 of these 12 mils out. So for the back one, the easiest way I found is I just have a regular size 12 on a socket wrench, and you can just sneak it right in like that. Start working it off. It's going to be the same case for this front one here. Let's go ahead and start working it off. All right, and then for this one here, you should be able to just take an extension and then just drop it right on, and that's going to be the easiest one. We're going to leave the easiest one for last, and I'm going to inch that off as I hold the body of the strut to drop it out. So let's go ahead and get this one out, and then we'll get that last one out. All right, so I'm on to this last nut here on this strut stud, so I'm going to start working it off. And what I'm going to do is hold the body of the strut under here with my hand while I do it, so I don't let it fly and go falling all over the place when that last nut comes off of the top. So let's go ahead, get this one backed off, and then we'll work that strut right out. All right, so I got that top nut off there. You can go ahead and start lowering this down. And you want to sneak it in between the ABS wire and the brake hose. And now we have the full strut assembly free. And now we should be able to get that control arm in with no issues, no obstructions. It should go straight in. All right, so we have our new control arm here. Make sure you get your bushing supports right here on. And I'm going to go in under, just as we took it out, underneath of that line. And now I should get a straight shot on this to be able to force it in from the front. Let's see here. There it is, guys. Got it pressed in. As you can see, it's moving around. Try to get it aligned with that hole. Let's go ahead and grab the bolt for that, and I should be able to start getting that thing aligned. So let's go ahead and work this in to align it. There it is. And it was that much easier because we had the whole strut assembly out. So went in perfect, guys, and we could go ahead and start putting everything back together. All right, so we got this in finally on that front mount. So we got the 19 mil push through. Now we are going to torque that to spec, but we're going to leave it just as is for right now. We're going to go ahead and get this back mount here, the rear mount here. We're going to get that aligned. We're going to get both bolts pushed through on that, and then we'll worry about piecing everything else together. So let's go ahead and grab both of those bolts and get those started in on the rear mount. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get this rear mount aligned here. So I'm just going to press it down pretty much into its orientation. Now remember, there are 2 different size bolts for that rear mount. You have the big, longer one. That one goes on the inner part. So that's on the inner part, and then the shorter one is on this outer part. And so I have our shorter bolt here. I'm going to see if I can go ahead and get this front one here on the outer portion started. At least push through our hole on the bottom. All right, I got that one started a bit. I'm going to go ahead and try to get that rear one in. Let's see if I can get this rear one going here. All right, so I do have that rear one going. So I want to go ahead and start threading the nut on that just to hold that in place. So let me see if I can sneak in there real quick. Sorry if I'm blocking it, but there we go. We got that one started. Let's see if we can get this other front one on here now, pushed up through. And we're going to go ahead and start the nut on that as well. All right, so we got that one pressed up through. And now I'm just going to take the nut on this, go ahead and get that started as well. All right, now I want to go ahead and try to get these both finger tight the best that I can, and then we'll go ahead and start piecing everything back together, and we'll get those torqued when we're ready. All right, so I have pretty much both of those rear mounting bolts on this control arm finger tight. They're almost locked in. We will get those torqued to spec as we will with the front mount. So both of those are now in. So what we're going to do is just drop the strut back into place, and then we can just start piecing all this back together, and then we'll get everything torqued to spec. So I'm going to go ahead, grab the strut, we'll drop that in, and then we'll start getting that finger tight as well. All right, so what we're going to do is essentially just slide the strut right back into the strut mount. Just be careful up here, as there is a black metal plate that goes around it. So if you see this right there, that's going to move. So be careful, you want to keep that in place. I'm going to go ahead and try to get it aligned here. So you see how that thing is moving. You want to get that around the holes as perfect as possible so it doesn't fall all over the place when you go to push the strut up through the bottom. So let's go ahead and grab the strut and get this thing into the mount. All right, so I have the strut here. What I'm going to do is guide this in between the ABS line and the brake hose. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and sneak it around this control arm, and I'm going to go ahead and try to press it right back up into the strut mount tower on the upper part in the engine bay. All right, guys, and what I did is I pressed the control arm down, and I pressed the bottom of the strut into position to hold that in place so I don't have to sit there and hold the strut. All right, so now that we have that in position, we can come up to the top. You can see that our metal support ring is around. So I just have one of the nuts here. I'm going to start with this back stud because it's the easiest to access. Go ahead and get that one started, and then we'll grab the other two and get them started finger tight as well. All right, so all three of our upper strut mount nuts are now finger tight. So now if we come down here, our strut is pretty much in position, and we can continue with the reassembly. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to press this essentially right into the position it needs to be. All right, so now we kind of have that aligned. All right, and now that the bottom of the strut is pretty much back in orientation with the bottom of the control arm, I'm going to take the black bracket that we removed here, and we're going to go ahead and put this on. So I'm just going to grab the 14 mils here. We're just going to get them started, and we're going to get all three of these 14 mils started off, and then we'll just go ahead and secure these in onto the control arm. All right, so we got our black bracket here securely on the control arm. So now that's seated in there nice, and what we can do is go ahead and get this prepped for installation. So most of the time when you buy a new control arm, it'll come with a new nut and this cover on the bushing. So went ahead and took that off. All right, so that's ready. And now we can go ahead and swing our entire steering knuckle back into position on the jack, and we're going to go ahead and try to get everything aligned up. All right, so if you remember, we pushed the steering knuckle over to the side to have room to get the control arm out and in. So I'm going to go ahead and swing this back into position. Be careful, because that thing almost just fell on me. All right. Now my goal here is to try to get that bottom ball joint aligned, and then I'm going to try to jack it up using the jack that I have to support it, and hopefully we can get it in a good position. All right, so I'm jacking it up. If my arm or anything's in the way, I apologize. Trying to get the best angle while doing this is not easy. All right. It's pretty much in position. Now, one thing I also want to do is bring down the upper control arm. And if I can get the bolt pushed in through that, it'll help give me some holding room so I don't have to hold this in place the entire time. So all right, so I got the upper bolt going. There we go, holding it in place. And what I'm going to do now is try to work the bottom ball joint on the control arm into the knuckle, and then we should be in a good place. All right, so we got that bolt started in the upper ball joint. We're going to come to the bottom here on the lower ball joint. So like I said, the goal is to get the bottom of the knuckle to start seating. I'm going to go ahead and slide that cone on. All right, so we're going to let that drop into the knuckle, and then from there I'm going to press this and align it at the same time with the jack to start getting that thing to align onto the ball joint. All right, this might be a bit tricky, but should be able to do it with a little bit of effort. All right, it's pretty good now that I have that in position. So now I could go ahead, take the nut, get that started, and we'll have the control arm pretty much in position and all locked in finger tight. All right, now this new control arm did come with a new nut, but I'm going to reuse the OEM one. It's actually a size smaller, so it's still a 22 mil. The other one I believe is a 23. It's definitely not a 22. And I just think it'll give it that OEM look still. Try to help this thing look as OEM as possible. All right, so that's getting started. I'm just going to move that jack off a hair, and I'm just finger threading this thing on, guys. There we go. Let it go. That's in a pretty good spot for right now, and then we could go ahead and work on getting everything else pieced back together. We're going to get the bottom of the shock aligned with the sway bar end link and all that, and then we'll get everything torqued to spec. All right, so our next goal here is to get the bottom of the strut assembly aligned with that black bracket. As you see, if I move it, it's aligning it perfect, and then the actual stud of the sway bar end link is going to go through. So how we're going to do it is I'm going to start on this side. We're going to go ahead and take our sway bar end link here, get it started. The washer goes on this side, so what I'm going to do is slide this through while I'm aligning it. All right, so you can see I got that slid through, and now what I can do is go ahead and take the end link, push it back through the sway bar, and I could go ahead and get this nut started on the other side of that end link to secure it in. We'll just get that finger tight for now, and then we can come on to the other side, and you can see that we got it all the way through the bracket. And we'll go ahead and start the nut on this side for the bottom of the strut and the end of the end link. All right, so we pretty much have the entire suspension piece back together. Nothing is torqued, everything is about finger tight. All right, now what we're going to do is torque everything to spec. Typically, and best practice, ideally, you want to torque everything to spec with the suspension under load, but obviously that's not always getting done, not even in the shop, and it's not always possible. So what we're going to do, and why we did it the way we did, is I have everything reattached, so it's pretty much in the orientation it should be with everything attached. We're not torquing, you know, the back of the control arm with the whole knuckle out. We got everything essentially in place, and we're going to torque everything to spec as we sit right now. So we're going to go ahead, get the torque wrench out. We'll get each thing that we took apart torqued to spec, and then we'll go ahead and finalize this install. All right, so we have all of the suspension back together, finger tight, including the top of the strut mount, which is where we're going to start with torquing. So these three 12 mils holding in the strut at the top of the tower are 22 foot-pounds. So we're going to go ahead, lock the torque wrench in, 22 foot-pounds to get all three of these torqued to spec. All right, first one's locked in. We're going to do the same thing for the other two. All right, we got all three of our strut mount bolts, 12 mils, torqued to spec, and now we're going to move on down into the wheel well, and we'll get everything else on the control arm and everything that we took apart torqued to spec. All right, so we got all three upper strut mount nuts torqued to spec. We're going to go ahead and get this bottom 19 mil nut that holds it into the control arm. The torque spec for this is 120 foot-pounds, okay? So I got it locked in, 120, 19 mil. Let's go ahead and get this thing locked in. And if you get this tight enough, finger tight wise, you shouldn't have to hold a wrench or anything on the other side, on the end link side. You should be able to get this torqued home. All right, there we go, guys. Locked in, 120 foot-pounds. All right, lower strut mount nut torqued to spec. We're going to come on the other side of the end link. We're going to go ahead and get the end link where it mounts to the actual sway bar. We're going to go ahead and get that 17 millimeter nut torqued to spec, and the torque spec is 62 foot-pounds. All right, so we're going to lock in 62 foot-pounds to get that end link nut onto the sway bar torqued to spec. All right, guys, as you can see, 17 mil, got the torque wrench on already. Now, I already have it pretty tight, so I shouldn't have to put a wrench on the opposite side here of the sway bar, but I should be able to lock this in 62 without having to put anything on the other side. Yep, there it is, guys. Barely turned it, locked in, 62 foot-pounds. All right, so we got the end link all torqued to spec. We're going to keep moving right along. We're going to go ahead and get the rear, all right, this rear mount. We're We're gonna get these torqued to spec, and they are 65 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna hold a wrench up on the nut here, just like we did when we took it off, torque wrench at the bottom, and lock it in at 65 foot-pounds for both the front and rear bolts. All right, guys, so 17 mil. Go ahead and slide the 17 mil right on the top on the nut, and then we're gonna go ahead and go from the bottom with the 17 mil torque wrench, with the 17 mil on the torque wrench, and we're gonna lock this in 65 foot-pounds. All right, there we go, guys. 65 foot-pounds on the front one, and then we just got to do the same thing for the rear. All right, I got both the front and the rear mounting nuts and bolts torqued to 65 foot-pounds, so that is all done. Now we're going to go ahead and move to the front one here. So the nut and the bolt, this 19 mil on the front mount of the control arm, is 89 foot-pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and try to sneak my torque wrench in on this side, wrench on the back. 19 mil. Let's go ahead and get this locked in, 89 foot-pounds. All right, so we got that one locked in. Front control arm mount, 89 foot-pounds. So pretty much have this all pieced back together. We're gonna go ahead and get the lower ball joint now. All right, the one right here going into the knuckle, and we're gonna go ahead and get that torque to spec. All right, so we pretty much have this 22 locked in. I hit it with the impact just to get it till it was tight. As you can see, the bushing is seated. It's in position. We got the cone in. Everything's good. We have no play. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and torque this to spec. Now the torque spec is 100 foot-pounds. All right, so torque wrench locked in, 100 foot-pounds. There it is, guys, locked in, 100 foot-pounds. Actually turned the wheel as I was doing that. I was pulling it, and if you can see, there is a hole right there for the cotter pin. So we're going to go ahead, put the new cotter pin in, and then we can go ahead and finish this up. All right, so our cotter pin hole didn't align in the best spot possible. You do somewhat have control over that, but I guess I let it get away from me, and I got it in a position that kind of sucks because the back of it's up against the dust shield. But I'm just going to take my same wire stripper cutters, whatever that I had when I did this, and took it off. I'm going to bend them into position here, so bend them a little more out of the way of this dust shield. Kind of almost bend it up to the bottom. There we go, and that should be fine. You just need to get it seated, bent in a position where if it was to back off, this would prevent it from coming off. So cotter pins in, guys. We're all good there. We can go ahead and finish up with the install. All right, so we pretty much have everything torqued to spec except for our upper ball joint. So we did get this 14mm bolt back in. Here is the nut. Let's go ahead and finger thread that on. And I'm just going to take an impact, seat it, and then we're going to torque it to spec. All right, so the torque spec for this is 41 foot-pounds. All right, so I have the torque wrench locked in, 41 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead, get this thing locked in. And you might or might not have to throw a 14 on the other side. And there it is, guys, 41 foot-pounds, and we have that whole upper ball joint locked in, good to go. So essentially everything is torqued to spec. We got everything reassembled. The only thing we still have here is the brake line and the ABS sensor, which is still the last thing we just have to put back together. So here is the brake hose. It should slide into an orientation right up against that bottom tab on the bottom. Hopefully you can see that. I'm gonna go ahead, thread this back on. It is a 12, so I'm just going to take a 12 with an impact and just lightly shoot that on, and that should be just fine. You could use a socket wrench, whatever you want. That's good on there. All right, and now we just have to press the ABS harness right here back into these two tabs. So there's two tabs here and here. All right, so let's go ahead and get these back seated. So I'm gonna press this one in, press it in. There we go. All right, so ABS harness is back pressed in, brake line back routed, All right, everything is back where it belongs. Everything is torqued to spec, and we fully got this right control arm here on the passenger side fully installed. Now the driver should essentially be the same, but this was the passenger if you couldn't tell. And there we go, guys, completely installed. Everything back how it was. All right, so we are fully back together, guys. So I hope this helped with replacing the front lower control arm on your 370Z. Make sure you stay tuned because you never know when I might be wrenching on this thing again. And until next time, guys.